All right, let's turn in our Bibles to Ezekiel. And you say, wow, Ezekiel. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, and then comes Ezekiel. We're not going to get ground up in the wheels of Ezekiel, so don't worry about that. Let's go to chapter 22, please. I have been studying through Ezekiel, and I've been enjoying a lot of things that have to do with the assembly. So we're going to look at a verse in chapter 22. And just before I mention the verse, I think everyone here knows that Ezekiel has been carried off into captivity. So by this time, Jerusalem is devastated, and they're all up in Babylon. And God is going to speak to Ezekiel, and he's going to bring before them the reason for being carried off into captivity. But also, chapter 40 to 48 is all going to be about the millennial kingdom. So there still is a future for the nation. But what is amazing is the charges that God brings against the Levites in the prophecy. So you know that there were the 12 tribes. One of those tribes, Levi, that whole tribe was taken. And even when they camped, they all camped right around the tabernacle system, right? And they actually were the people that went to God on behalf of the people and so on and so forth. So they were to be the example for the children of Israel. But they failed. So we can learn very practical lessons. We have no idea who is looking at us. Our immediate family is looking at us. A lot of us, our spouses are looking at us. And sometimes people, we all are like this, we all need somebody to encourage us. Sometimes when we see someone living positively, it gives us the to go and do it. Other times we see them living negatively, and it can pull us down as well. So I want you to notice what God says, chapter 22, Ezekiel 22, and verse number 26. Now, I'm breaking into the middle of a little section here because he talks about the prophets, and then he touches her priests. Verse 27, her princes. Verse 29, the people. And then you'll notice verse number 30, and I sought for a man. So this nation had fallen so low that there wasn't even one man. That's kind of sad. But I want you to look at verse number 26. Her priests have violated my law and have profaned, it's the idea of making common, and have profaned my holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane or common, neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. I am made common among them. That was the charge. So you might think, well, okay, here are these priests, and they were to be occupied with the holy, the secular. And they were to be living and presenting God's truth to the nation of Israel. And you know that when the children of Israel came into the land, Moses didn't make it into the land. We understand that. The book of Deuteronomy, he's really encouraging them. And he reminds the people of the God that they had, the living God, that had given them the living word. They had commandments like no one else had. All the other nations were just worshiping things that were dead. And he warned them. You're going to see things. You're going to hear things. Because God purposely left some nations, pagan nations, in the land. You go to the book of, Judges. You'll find out that it was to test his people. Do you know why God didn't save us and take us straight out of the world? Our brother mentioned Romans 6. Do you know why when God saved us, he didn't take away the wicked heart? It is to test us. Do we really love our God? If I'm faced with a choice, that's when I prove my love to God. If I was saved by God and turned into a robot, what good would that be to God? Just programmed to worship God. But when I have a choice to make, I can either go this way or I can go this way. That's what brings pleasure to God when I choose the right way. Of course, that reminds him, I believe, of his son. because he always did that which was right. But here are these Levites. They're in the land. Now God is saying, I just would like us to get a hold of this, because I want to remind us of the environment that we're constantly in. You know that we're in an environment that is watering everything down. I can only tell you from where I come from. I remember years ago, people would go to funerals and they would dress up for a funeral. Now, people come in their shorts and their flip-flops. They don't care. Now, I'm not trying to say we have to wear suits and meet. I'm not even going there. I don't want you to think that for a minute. I'm just looking at more the attitude. You know that the respect for mom and dad today. Who's mom and dad? You know the respect for authority. Who are the teachers? We're in a me generation. It's all about me. Everything is about me. And you know, even in school system, the grading system, everything is, we don't want anyone to fail. Everybody's got to pass. It doesn't really matter. That is creeping in amongst us just as believers. Do you know, it's amazing. One of the number one things that God through Ezekiel will identify the people is how they profaned God's Sabbath. That's amazing. You know, it's amazing that God doesn't really require, dear child of God, a lot of us when you really stop and think about it. Think of what we have in this dispensation. One day that's called the Lord's Day. Now, don't jump ahead and think, oh, Scott, you're going to try to tell us that the Lord's Day, we should live it like the Sabbath. I'm not even going there, because I know enough from my Bible to know that the Lord's Day is not a replacement of the Sabbath. It's not even an advancement of the Sabbath. It is completely distinct from an old dispensation where they had to work 6 days to get a rest. We start with a rest and then go out to work. You couldn't get more of a distinction between law and grace. But what I am trying to come at is this. Our brother mentioned this morning, the pressures of life, and we're busy. And if you think preachers have all kinds of time, like you got rocks in your head, because it gets busy. Do you understand that just in traveling, and I can get away from God? Just preparing for others, I can get away from God. Now, you know how busy your life is. The one that died for us and lived for us, do we just give him his portion? He doesn't ask for much. Like, he allows us to work, and there's time for self, and there's time for family, and there's time for this. And sometimes we can come to the Lord's Supper like we did this morning, and you know what? You sit down and you just go, if you were honest, you'd say, God, I got nothing. I've been too busy. I have allowed my life to be too busy. This is what happened to the children of Israel. I know this is the Sabbath, but I couldn't get all these things done, so I'm just going to do it here. And the Levites, they didn't say, whoa, people, whoa. They just went right along with it. They were supposed to be the people that stood up and showed the example. And the end result, this is what God says. There they are in captivity. The end result, he says, is, I'm made common. When you and I make no distinction between spiritual things and secular things, we just treat everything as if everything's the same. It doesn't matter. It matters to God. So I want us all to try to get out of the rut, just going to a church building. And then your midweek Bible study. Those that don't come, I bet you know at home who's going to be here. The faithfuls. The core. And you say, oh, they'll get along without me. They don't need me. The Lord wants you here. I hope we all understand that being part of a New Testament church is one of the greatest privileges this side of eternity. It's not a light thing. I mean, we can go through the Bible and God is everywhere. We understand that. He's everywhere. But there is a unique presence when we're here. There's something very unique about a New Testament church where you have the Spirit of God moving on the priesthood of all believers. And different things are being spoken. We have no idea how that invigorates us, how that feeds us. It's different. There's a different level from individually studying the Bible to a corporate company gathered to the Lord's name. It's very unique. There's nothing like it on the face of the earth. But once we start to step back and think, whatever. Listen, I want to encourage us all in the business of life. Don't look for time to fit the assembly in. You schedule everything around the assembly. You'll be shocked at how God can bless your life. That is giving God his place. You might remember Eli. Eli was a high priest. It's a very sad situation, Eli. Eli had 2 boys. You go to Samuel and read it. And those 2 boys were actually committing fornication, literal fornication, right in front of the tabernacle. And the meat that was supposed to be offered to God, they wanted it for their own stomach. And they would take it off the altar. God in the Old Testament called the altar, the brazen altar. You know what he called it? He says, my table. It's what I feed on. And here were these people taking animal sacrifice to give to God, and these boys were gluttons. I'm just going to give God a portion. I'm going to take a nice hunk of beef for myself and eat it. And you know what? Eli didn't judge his boys hard enough. And a man of God comes to Eli one day. We're not told his name. And God has to speak to Eli through that prophet. You know what he says to him? You're going to lose your priesthood. I'm going to cut it off. You have not judged your boys hard enough when it comes to spiritual things. And you know the expression, we all know it. Here's what the man of God says. God says, them that honor me, I will honor. But don't stop there. Read the rest of the verse. Those that despise me will I lightly esteem. There is a positive blessing. There's a negative curse. So there are consequences to everything that we do. That, dear child of God, is the result of you and I being delivered from hell. Because when the Lord Jesus shed his blood and I came into the good of it, the Lord Jesus, God bought me lock, stock, and barrel. Body, soul, and spirit. And the New Testament teaches we're not our own. We're bought with a price. But it's easy as a Christian to live like we are our own. I'm speaking to myself now. This spoke to me. So do I make a distinction? Are secular things more important than spiritual things? Just think of it. Now I want you to come ahead. Let's come ahead to further into Ezekiel. Let's come ahead to chapter, I think it's 43. Let me get my notes out here. Go to chapter 44, Ezekiel 44. Now his mind is going to be taken right into the millennium. And notice what God will pick up. In contrast to chapter 22, look at chapter 44 and verse 23. Here's what he says. This is referring to the Levites, a particular class of Levites in the millennium. And they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and profane, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. Now, the millennial reign of Christ is going to last for 1,000 years. And God is going to make sure that I have this lived out. And a restored nation will look upon the Levites, a certain line of them, and they will show these people. Now, does the name Zadok mean anything to you? Z-A-D-O-K. The sons of Zadok. If you look at the tribe of Levite, and there's the number of sons and all the different families that come through that, right? You're going to find out, do you remember Aaron? Aaron had 4 sons. And do you remember shortly after the tabernacle was built, Leviticus chapter 10, 2 of those boys brought in strange fire, and the fire of God came out and struck them dead. That left 2 other sons of Aaron. And from those sons would be different types of priests and so on and so forth. Abiathar and Ithamar were the 2 boys that were left. Do you know where God promised eternal, it's a lovely phrase in the Bible, the eternal priesthood, was through Ithamar. And that's where the sons of Zadok come from. Now, I just want you to follow this for a minute. This boy up here, Abiathar, he ended up producing Eli. Remember the curse that God said on Eli? In our English Bible, it's, I will cut off your outstretched arm. It's the idea of your seed carrying on the priesthood. God says, I want to cut it off. Well, that's where Eli came from. So when God gave that curse upon him, I will cut off the line. Do you know where that came true? You got to go ahead about 140 some years. Do you remember David is on the throne? And there is a priest there called, the 2 priests at the time were Abiathar and Zadok. Okay? Do you remember the uprising of Absalom? And these 2 priests remained loyal to David. That was a good day. Then later on, when David's about to die, Solomon is about to come to the throne. Do you remember a boy by the name of Adonijah? He wanted the throne over Solomon. Do you know what Abiathar did? He separated from Zadok. Abiathar traces back to not the son that was given the eternal, Eli, that whole line. And he goes over with Adonijah and joins his hand. And you know that thing ends. Do you know what Solomon does to David when David's about to die? He says, David, you remember what he did? You make sure you cut him off. Put him out of the priesthood. And that's when the whole line of Eli ends. And you know what's left all through the reign of Solomon, which is a lovely picture of the millennium? The sons of Zadok are serving the king, therefore serving God. But let me back up for a minute. Do you remember the time when Saul was hunting David? Do you remember how many priests Saul had killed? 80. Do you know where all those priests traced their line to? Right back to Eli. That was God fulfilling his word. On one day, 80 priests lost their lives. That was God fulfilling his word. We serve a God that's holy, brother and sister. The consequences that Eli worked out, little did he realize, 145 years into the future, it would have such an effect. 80 people cut down in one day. And that's when Abiathar, the one boy, he escaped. And God didn't lose sight of him. Because eventually, he was put out of the priesthood. And just as God said, the priesthood through Eli, bang, came to an end. Now the sons of Zadok. And in the millennial reign, do you know what the Lord will do? He will separate, you find this in Ezekiel, he will separate the sons of Zadok from the rest of the Levites. And they will stand. Remember I told you way back at the beginning, all the Levites camped right around the tabernacle. Do you know what God's going to do in the millennial reign? Only the sons of Zadok get to camp around the new temple. The Levites are separated by like 50, 60 some miles to the north. So I'm trying to show you the consequences of actions. All of us here are parents, most of us. I think all of us are parents. We have no, sorry, you're shaking his head, you're right, not yet. We have no idea of the spiritual consequences on our children from mom and dad, from Grampy and Grammy. Keep on going. I've just been impressed with this. a big new thing has happened to me. My oldest daughter had her first child December the 15th. I'm now grampy. It's quite a shock. It's kind of hard to really take on board. I am adjusting to it, but when I see his little face, I kind of like it. But when someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, Grampy," bang! That's what you feel like doing. Now you're looking at another generation. What is the best thing I can do for that child? Give it everything it wants? No. Spoil it rotten? No. Impress upon it. Live for God. Truth. It's the only thing that matters in this world. Everything else, sure, take it, leave it, whatever. So that's what I learned from Ezekiel. It's a tremendous thing. I'll go a little bit further. I want you to look at chapter 43, just back up a little bit. And this is rather interesting. This ties right in with the profane and the unholy and everything else. Look at what God will say in chapter 43 and verse number 7. Here's what he's going to say to these people now. This is quite interesting. Chapter 43 and verse 7. Let me pick up here. Okay, verse 7. "And he said unto me, Son of man, the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever," this is the millennial reign, "and my holy name shall the house of Israel no more defile, neither they nor their kings by their whoredoms." Now, I understand that. I mean, they were marrying paganitish women and everything else. I understand that statement. Listen to this. "Nor by the carcasses of their kings in their high places, in their setting of their threshold," this idea of a house, "by my threshold, my house, and their post by my post, and the wall between me and them, they have even defiled my holy name by their abominations." It was a common thing in the Old Testament. God allowed it, but I'm surprised why it's so heavily condemned in Ezekiel. God allowed, do you remember the kings where they were buried? Right in the city of Jerusalem. What was right in the city of Jerusalem? That's where the temple was. That's what God's getting at. And God is looking back and he says, listen, do you remember when those kings used to be buried right beside my house? You ended up defiling my holy name. He says, I'm not going to allow it in the millennium. And when you take a look at the geography of Israel, Ezekiel will give it to you. There's going to be a 50-mile by 50-mile square piece of ground taken, and it's called a holy oblation, a holy offering unto the Lord. Do you know where God's going to put it? Right in the center of Israel. There's going to be the tribes to the north and the tribes to the south, and right in the middle, God is going to put the temple smack in the middle. Do you know the lesson I learned from that? Is God's house in the middle of your life? He says, I'm going to teach this nation a lesson about me through geography. Right smack in the middle. Now, if you tie Isaiah chapter 2 and you bring in Jeremiah and you bring in Ezekiel, do you know where God's going to put it? It says on the top of the mountains. This temple. Of all the land of this earth is going to be changed through the 7-year tribulation. What's going to be left is a massive mountain way off there in Israel. And God's temple will be right on the very top of it. So not only in the center, but right on the very top. So I ask myself, is God the top and the center of my life? Challenging, isn't it? It's easy to say this stuff. It's desperate hard, Monday to Saturday, to live it. To let your life, without even opening your mouth, someone just looks at you and says, that person is living for God. No hesitation. So here he says, top of the mountain, right in the very center. And then when you start to look, he even tells us, the Levites, think of 3 strips of land like this, in that big 50-50 square thing. The Levites, way up here. The temple, in here. Sons of Zadok all around them. Down here, the city of Jerusalem. God's temple in the millennial reign will be at close to 10 miles from the city. Whereas in the Old Testament, the city and the temple were together, and the kings were buried, and God says, you defiled my name by putting those dead carcasses next to me. God says, in the millennium, my temple will be 10 miles away from the city. And guess what? It'll have a 10-foot wall around it, 10 by 10 by 10. You think, God, we're in the millennial reign. Christ is on the throne. Why do you need a wall? God always believes in separation. Always the distinction. And you know what's interesting about this temple compared to the city of Jerusalem with all its different 12 gates? This temple, just 3 gates. 3 gates. No gate to the west. A gate to the south, the north, a gate to the south, and a gate to the east. Do you know what we're told about that east gate? Only the glory of God will come into it once and stay. And then every week thereafter, a person that's called the Prince, which represents Christ, will come in through the east gate. That's it. It's reserved for him. And then you know what God says? When the children of Israel and the nations of the world, you got to understand, this temple, the size of this temple, I'm not even going to get into that, it's fantastic, will be the only religious system on the face of the millennial earth. Think of all the different churches. Think of all the people of God scattered all throughout this world, all over the place. Absolute chaos. Do you know what God says during the millennium? Just one building. Just one building. And God says, if the nations don't come up at least 3 times a year, I'll send famine. I'll send plagues. And they're all, look, I'm just getting revved up here. I gotta end. It's amazing. Do you know what God says? The temple is, the way things are worded just causes your mind to go, wow, okay, what that means. On the tops of mountains, and do you know what it says about all the nations of the world? They will flow into it. How does something flow uphill? It's the weirdest expression. All nations will just simply flow up into Jerusalem. Here's another fascinating thing about that temple. There's nothing like it or has ever been on this earth. It's the river. Right out of the holies of holies comes a river. It goes on the right side of the altar. It comes out of the temple gate. And then you know what the Bible tells us? Every 1,500 feet, the river gets wider and deeper. Wider and deeper. And it goes out and it floods the whole world. You say now that's, you know, a river is always biggest at its source. But not with God. My mind went quickly to the Garden of Eden. Remember the river there linked with God? Then my mind went to Revelation. Remember that satellite city during the millennial reign where you and I will be the bride of Christ hovering over this earth, giving Christ's light going right through the city. Remember God talks about a river there too? God does a lot with water. River. So anyways, I need to end. I'm just all revved up, ready to go here. But anyway, it's a tremendous thing. Here's what to get a hold of. The very same presence that will be in that temple is the very same presence that's here. Therefore, God demands the same respect. So do we give him that? Do we give him his rightful place? That's the question I want us all to consider. We can get so lackadaisia. Whatever. Doesn't matter. Dear child of God, in the coming day it will matter. Don't live with regrets. Give God everything. Center your life around him. Ask for help and he'll guide you. He'll bless us like no one else can. Should I close in prayer? Okay, let's bow our heads. Thank you for listening.